I almost had it right. That is all right. Now they get to see my facial expressions when I do the intro. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. Yeah, you know the routine. This is William Hall from Kingsland, Texas, USA. This week with my dear sweet friend. He's a rabbi to me, Ira Michaelson from the Holy Land of Israel. Ira, welcome back to the show, my friend. It's such a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
That's awesome. That's awesome. In my zeal for excitement for getting everything set up, I missed one of my video clips. That's okay though. I hope you'll catch it on the outside. So first, how have you been? It's been a while since you've been in the studio. I know you've been busy. You had a great Texas tour trip with Rav Dror. And then you've got changes going on in your life right now, which is probably going to cater to my selfishness, and that's getting you back in the teacher seat a little bit more often. So tell us a little bit about what's going on in your world right now before we get kicked off with the Torah portion.
So, as you mentioned, it was kind of a whirlwind. It wasn't just a Texas tour. It was 6 weeks, and I forgot how many planes we were on, something like 12 planes, and
Right.
10 or 11 cities, and even South America, and it was very interesting. It's really wonderful to get around, though. As much as it took us a really long time to recover, obviously, because you go through all these different time zones, and then you come back to Israel, and there's the 7 or 8 hour time difference, and getting used to it. But it really is amazing getting to meet people. I was just sharing with my my balabait, the owner of the apartment that we rent in Israel. She came over today. We signed a new lease for a couple of years, and I was sharing with her about what I do, and I was telling her the story about how you and I met.
Oh, wow.
And how you started Tanakh Talk as a result of me choosing to stop off in Kingsland, on my way to Houston. Teaching at Nativ. And that's the beauty of this. The beauty of whether I'm out on my own or working with Rav Dror is the idea of being able to get out there and meeting so many people and inspiring people. I mean, that's really all of us that do this. People like myself, Rabbi Skobach, Rabbi Singer, Rabbi Federo, I can go on, and the people that now that you're involved with and doing Tanakh Talk with, the whole reason that we do this is for inspiration and
Right.
is to inspire people to be better.
Well, I tell you what, I still, every time I see your face, I'm thankful for Hashem using you and in this path and causing you to want to come here, being willing to come here like that, and wanting to come here because I still think that there's no way that Rabbi Tovia Singer would have ever even thought about coming to a little podunk place like this to some guy he's never met before. And I was like, but wait a minute, you're friends with Ira, right? And he goes, Ira Michaelson, yeah, we're friends. And I said, well, he's been here and he survived it. It was kind of a joke, but I think that really opened his mind up a little bit more about that opportunity. So so
Right, but I mean, look, and Rabbi Federo had driven over from from San Antonio and stayed over, and he was the one that drove me from your house to Nativ, and then stayed in Houston before he went back. So
right.
And Stuart also came over when we were there in Houston with Rav Dror. So I would have never had that opportunity. We had known each other also only through Facebook, obviously, because I live in Israel and he's in Texas, and I hadn't gotten over to San Antonio yet. So it's like all of these connections that have been made as a result of all of us having this desire to get out there and to really share. And I think the important thing is recognizing that the importance of sharing with the nations, especially. I was just watching earlier. There's a great rabbi here in Israel. It's originally from the States, Rav Ginsburg, who I love. That's really very high spiritually as it relates to Kabbalah as well. And he does a once a month teaching online live stream. And I was thinking about something that he said, because a few years ago he did a whole teaching, and he's one of the few that came out from the traditional side of Orthodox Judaism that said we are in the days of teaching Torah to the nations.
Nice.
And and so it just, I saw this as a very, very positive sign today that he just happened to be doing his live stream today on the 11th of ER in the middle of counting of the Omer and Parshat Emor that we're in today, and it's just a beautiful thing. So I'm always happy to do it, and God willing, be able to do it more often. As you asked, I know we went off on a little trail there, but I've taken a break from. Most people know me from Beyond the Matrix and from A Light to the Nations, both shows that I've done with Rod Bryan for many years, and I just chose in the last few weeks to take a break from radio. I just feel at this point that I have so much responsibility in basically as the executive director of the Emunah Project for Rav Dror to put my time into that, but also to get back to the basics for me in writing again, in maybe putting out some more videos that I was doing with Leah, with my wife. As people were getting really inspired by the videos that we were doing together, and just spending more time doing the thing that I do rather than putting so much time into that one show a week.
Right.
You know how much work goes into what you do.
Right.
So yeah, I've taken a break from that, and basically, and now we're getting ready. The cat's kind of been out of the bag for a few days, but Rav Dror is actually leaving Israel again at the end of this month and is heading back to the U.S. And God willing, he's actually going to be staying about 3 or 4 months on this trip, basing out of New York, and will be available to travel all over the U.S. again.
Now, will you be joining him, or will you be running it from your office?
I am staying home on this one.
Okay, gotcha. I know you've got a lot of stuff going on there, like you mentioned before. I mean, you pretty much got a full studio set up at your place where you try to run this Emunah project from, and I think that's pretty amazing that you're still able to do that. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
You know.
So we had the Emunah Center that we had, and we closed the center not because we really wanted to. It was more of a technical issue. Not really necessary for me to go into details, but it was a technical issue with the city, and that's why we ended up closing the center. But nothing's changed as far as the Emunah Project, what we do, the kind of work that we're doing, the kind of help that we give people from the Emunah Project, and also, of course, getting Rav Dror's message out and doing his videos. And so, we're still rocking and rolling when it comes to that. And of course, I'll be, we have a whole team here in Israel that'll still be working on those things as he's teaching across the U.S.
That's awesome. And so I put up your emunah.com on just your name tag earlier, but you can also find Ira's work at TORAHthreads.com. And then if you want to follow the Emunah Project on YouTube, that you can just simply search Rav Dror, D-R-O-R, on YouTube, and you can find Rav Dror and Ira's work there as well. So it's up on your screen for a minute, so if you don't know how to spell it, write it down real fast and I'll take it down. So okay, so I guess with that said, we'll project forward. So this week's Torah portion, Torah Parsha, Emor, and then last week was Acharei Kedoshim. No, yeah.
Acharei Mot, yeah, it was a double portion of Acharei Mot and Kedoshim.
So that was after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, right? I get confused. Acharei Mot, and then isn't there one just called Acharei where it's talking about maybe something about the death of Moses or something? What is that Parsha? Just clarify in my head. That's been bugging me all day.
No, Acharei Mot is after the Acharei Mot. Basically means after the death, and it's talking about after the death of Nadav and Avihu, and it goes into
laws of holiness.
Yeah, we go into this idea of sanctification and holiness as it relates to how Hashem is going to be approached.
Okay.
And then in Kedoshim, actually, if we look at the end of Kedoshim, it's very interesting. We go through this, in Vayikra, in Leviticus, really the way it has to be viewed in context is that Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, are still in this process of getting ready to enter into the land, and what they're being given is all of the instructions that they need to do to be holy and to be sanctified before Hashem when they enter into the land. In other words, there's this idea of separating themselves out from the nations. We see Hashem say to them, I don't want you to be like the Egyptians that I brought you out from, and I don't want you to be like the people, like the Canaanites in the land that I'm bringing you into. There were issues on both sides. Idolatry, sexual immorality, things like that were going on, both in the pagan culture of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, and with the people that were living in the land that Hashem was bringing them into. And so you see very interesting, the last few verses in Leviticus chapter 20, actually the last two verses I find very interesting. It says, in the Hebrew it says, V'hitem li kedoshim. You have to excuse me with my eyes this late at night. Ki kadosh, ani Hashem va'avdil etchem min ha'amim lihiyot li. And then it says, V'ish o isha ki yeheh vahem ov o yidoni mot yumatu ba'aven yirgamu otam demehem bam. I read it in Hebrew because there's two very interesting words that we see in there. I'll read you the English first. It basically says, "You shall be holy for me, for I Hashem am holy, and I have separated you from the peoples to be mine." See, that's where we get back into what I just talked about, where he talks about separating them from the peoples. And then this last verse says, "And any man or woman in whom there shall be the sorcery of Ov, or of Yidoni, they shall be put to death. They shall pelt them with stones, their blood is upon themselves." It's interesting. For some reason, I always try to get away from doing the counter-missionary stuff, but for some reason it always draws me. Every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. And it's every time I'm on with you, William. So it's very interesting, this concept of Ov and Yidoni. We see this word Ov. I got really deep into studying that particular word as it relates to Samuel, the prophet. Why? Because we have a situation where King Saul, it says, goes, and in most people's Bibles, the Christian Bible and things like that, they call her the Witch of Endor.
Right.
If you remember that story. Mm-hmm. That he goes and he goes to a witch, and he calls upon this witch to call up the prophet Samuel from the dead. What it says in the Hebrew, it doesn't call her a witch. It calls her Ba'alat Ov. It calls her the mistress of the Ov. Okay? And I started looking into this concept of this word Ov. And the Ov in Yidoni usually is related to some type of spirit. It's related to sorcery in a way. And this Ov actually is very interesting when you study the word. One of the translations that I found for it was, and I might have talked about this on one of your previous shows, called a skin bottle. And I thought to myself, what the heck is a skin bottle? And really what it is it becomes a vessel for that person that's involved in the sorcery. So in other words, when King Saul went to this Ba'alat Ov, to this person they call a witch, she was acting as a vessel for this spirit, for this Ov, kind of what we would call in the modern day, I guess, channeling a spirit by calling somebody up from the dead. And what's interesting is that the some of the things that are related to this skin bottle are the sounds that they make. It talked about chirping like birds and moaning and groaning and things like that. And what really came to a head for me was this whole concept of that we hear about in Christianity, and specifically charismatic Christianity, and the idea of speaking in tongues.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Because if you've ever been around people that claim to have that gift, they call it a gift. Oftentimes you'll hear the strangest sounds coming out of them, things that don't sound like words at all, moaning, groaning, grunting, chirping, all of these kind of things. And when you think about it, I think just the opposite of what their intent is in trying to actually believe that they're speaking some kind of holy language. I think that they're actually involved in sorcery, based on this idea of the Ov and the Yidoni. And I'm going to tell you how powerful when you see something like this in the Hebrew, because it goes on to say that the person involved in that, it says mot yumatu. Okay, whenever you see Hashem use this kind of two words together, mot meaning death and yumatu has the same root. He's basically saying saying in a way,
it's a sure
dead
thing.
You're gonna die.
Right.
He's giving you an assurance that this is such an abomination to him that typically what you're going to see is that it's translated, you will surely die.
Right.
But it's you couldn't say it in any stronger words when you see the words together like that, like mochumat or mochumatu, or you'll see that often throughout the Tanakh. When Hashem wants to get our attention of how bad something is to him. So
it's kind of like what Joseph, whenever the dream he interpreted, right? And he says, I've had the same dream twice, or whatever dream it was. And he said, well, you've had it twice, or these two dreams came about to let you know that it's definitely going to happen. You know,
right.
It's like it's at your feet right now. So
exactly.
Okay.
So the other important reason to talk about those last two verses is we're hitting home the point that obviously Hashem is talking about the need for holiness. So that when you come into Emor, the only change that we see happen from coming out of Kedoshim into Emor is the idea that this holiness now that's being spoken about is being spoken about as it relates to the Kohanim, as it relates to the priesthood. And it goes into all of the different instructions, the laws of the Kohanim, as it relates to who they're allowed to, what would be the word that I'm looking for, contaminate themselves. Okay. To be around a dead person. In other words, even in today's world, somebody who's a Kohen, somebody who's that's been passed down from generation to generation, and those are really the only two designations that we know for sure that people can really know what tribe they're from, is whether or not they're a Kohen or a Levi, is because that's passed down from father to son. Nobody else really knows what tribe they're from. In other words, I don't know what tribe I'm from. So we're called, those of us that are not Kohanim or Levi'im are called Yisrael.
Now this is a reason why, clarify for me, I know you said that you typically don't get into the counter-missionary stuff until you're like with me, so I'm going to throw one at you. So this is one of the reasons why they can't claim that Jesus came from from the right bloodline through his mother, because you don't get tribal affiliation through the mother, right? You get that through the father.
Exactly.
Thank you.
And,
okay.
And there's, if you go into the prophets, you'll see, and unfortunately I'm not Rabbi Tovia Singer, so I'm not, a walking Tanakh. I can't pull this one out of the air.
Okay.
But there is a verse in one of the later prophets that very clearly shows us that the designation of who is a Jew comes through the mother, through the bloodline of a mother. It's based on the fact that it says it speaks about somebody who has a Jewish mother but a non-Jewish father. It talks about it, and it gives you an understanding that the tribal affiliation comes through the father, but determining who's Jewish comes through the mother. And I know that that's an argument that goes on all the time, not only in Christianity but even people today, that are trying to find that identity will often struggle with that and argue those points and say, well, those are those rabbis that came up with these designations, and it doesn't mean anything, but it does mean something. It really comes down to this, and this is an important point as it relates to a Torah portion like we're talking about in Emor, when we start talking about things like the Moedim, the appointed times, that we get into in Leviticus chapter 23, and for instance the counting of the Emor, because there are people, the counting of the Emor, we'll talk about it in a few minutes. It talks about the day from which you shall start counting, and there's been a dispute for thousands of years on which day you should start counting from. For instance, the Karaites and the Sadducees at the time of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sadducees would say that the day after the Shabbat that is spoken of in Leviticus 23 is talking about the actual Shabbat, so that the counting should take place starting on that Sunday, and then it's always going to be a Sunday that Moed is going to fall on. We count within Orthodox Judaism from the day after Pesach, the day after Passover, because we believe that all the Moedim are called Shabbatot, that they're all considered days of rest. So there's been this argument that goes on back and forth, and it comes down to whether or not you're going to accept the fact that within normative Orthodox Judaism, we believe that the oral Torah, the Torah Shebel Peh, was given at Sinai at the same time that the written Torah was given. And I'll kind of give you an example. When you're dealing with context, did you ever read the book Animal Farm?
No, I haven't seen it.
You haven't? Okay, well, a lot of people read that book. It's called Animal Farm. It was written by a guy named George Orwell, and if you didn't know, and a lot of people I guess don't know, but if you didn't know the context in which that book was written, you would think that it's just a book about a bunch of animals that do some crazy stuff. But if you know the context of that book, Animal Farm, then you realize that it's about the Bolshevik Revolution, and that each one of the animals in this farm represents a different political point of view or a different political figure that was around during this Bolshevik Revolution. And so I bring that up to make the point that there are too many things within the Tanakh that we read that we have no way of knowing the details without being able to look at the oral Torah, without being able to look at the Talmud, to the Mishnah and the Gemara. We know that we're supposed to have circumcision, Brit Milah, but do we have details on how a circumcision is supposed to be done? No, we have detail. We don't have details on things like, we know that we're supposed to slaughter animals in a certain way, but we don't have details of what that way is. We only have that in the oral Torah. We know that we're told to keep the Shabbat. What does that mean, keep the Shabbat? What does it mean to stop your work on Shabbat? Work for me may be something totally different. So we have all of these things that we're not given details on, that we would never know what the details are without the oral Torah, which was then, obviously written down for us. at some point. It was an oral tradition that was passed down from generation to generation until there was the thought that if it was not put down on paper, that this would be lost for future generations. And so I think it's very important for people to understand that point as well, for why we do the things that we do, and why we look at verses like Devarim, Deuteronomy 17, that talks about going to the judges in that day, going to the Kohanim, going to the priest in that day, or the judge in that day, when you have a dispute and you don't know how to resolve it. This is our go-to verses to looking to our rabbis today, to our sages that pass these things on to us. So I always think it's funny when we get into these arguments, and you see these things go on Facebook all the time. And the first thing I always bring up to people is, you so easily bash the sages of Judaism and the rabbis of Judaism, and yet you wouldn't have anything to argue over if they had not preserved the thing that you get to argue over right now, even the written Torah, because they were the ones that preserved the texts for us. So it's a very important point that I don't mind bringing up every time we do a show.
Sure.
On the importance of recognizing that you cannot understand. There's really no way of understanding the Torah without the oral Torah attached to it.
Right, I agree.
I could even make the argument, and will at some point down the road, I don't know that we have time to do it today, that in the same way, the Kabbalah, which is totally misunderstood by most people, because they consider it mysticism and so forth, is actually reveals the intent of the Torah. And an argument could be made that one possibly also cannot understand fully the written Torah without a study of Kabbalah as well.
Interesting. That's a good point. Hey, just I'm going to do a quick derailment.
Sure.
On the YouTube page, someone asked if Abraham did not have the oral Torah, how did he circumcise himself? It's actually an
if he
interesting
didn't.
Yeah, if he didn't have the oral Torah before, because the Torah wasn't written yet, the oral Torah says if he didn't have the oral Torah, how did he circumcise himself, or how did he do it properly, or whatever?
But why would we say that he didn't have the oral Torah?
Right, because it's oral.
We know.
That's funny.
we know for a fact that there is a verse in the Tanakh that says that he kept all my chukot, all my mishpatim, all my mitzvot.
Good point.
So the question is, how could Avraham Avinu, how could Abraham have kept all of those things? Why would Hashem say of him, he kept all my statutes, he kept all my commandments, he kept all of my judgments and so forth, if he had not already been given some form of an oral tradition to pass on?
Right. That's funny.
Now, was it written down at that time? Of course not. But we know that the Torah existed from one of the things when you talk about the Kabbalah, it talks about in the Zohar, the idea, it says that Hashem looked into the Torah in order to bring creation. And one of the verses that the rabbis will always bring to support this in the Tanakh is from Mishlei, from Proverbs chapter 8, verse 30, which talks about, this is another verse that the Messianics and the Hebrew roots people love to try to attach to Jesus, starting with Proverbs chapter 8. I think in verse 23 or 24 it starts talking about chokhmah, talking about wisdom. And it talks about wisdom being by and beside Hashem from before the creation of the world. And it goes through this whole thing, and it says, I was by and beside him as a master craftsman. Really, when the Zohar is talking about looking into the Torah, that Hashem looked into the Torah, and in Proverbs 8:30, it talking about him being by and beside him as a master craftsman. It's this idea of a blueprint, that the Torah was the blueprint of creation, that it existed from before the time that Hashem brought this world into existence. So the Torah that we're talking about always existed.
Nice.
The fact that it was given in a new way at Har Sinai is is a different story, and that's the power of this month. This month of ER. There's another name for this month, and the other name for this month is Ziv. And Ziv means radiance. And it's such a powerful concept, this idea of the month of Ziv and the fact that it takes place in between the months that we're in now. In Nisan, where we have Pesach, where we have the leaving of Bnei Israel from Mitzrayim, and then coming into after this month of Iyar and the counting of the Omer, culminating in Shavuot when the Torah is given. And why is this powerful? When you think about it, there are discussions in some of the midrashim that prior to the giving of the Torah at Sinai, that there was kind of this disconnect. And what I mean by that is that when you study the Kabbalah, it's all about this light from Hashem. I'm kind of trying to make it as simple as I can. It's this idea of light emanating from Hashem in the upper world to the lower world that we live in. So there should always be this concept of Hashem kind of reaching down towards us to give light to us, and us reaching up towards him and to try and make ourselves vessels to accept the light that Hashem wants to give us. But what we see is that prior to the giving of the Torah, that there was maybe a disconnect there, that we did not see this, that there was a concealment, so to speak, of the concealment of Hashem giving us this full light. What's interesting is that we see when we talk about this idea of us reaching up and Hashem reaching down, we have these two words. What are these two words? We have descending and ascending, right? We have this light that we're expecting to descend to us, and we have us trying to ascend to Hashem in order to receive this light. What do we see at Mount Sinai? We see that this concealment, or this restriction that was in place, was nullified at the giving of the Torah. And how do we know that? Because it says that Hashem descended upon the mountain and Moshe Rabbeinu ascended to the mountain. So by Hashem descending and coming down on Har Sinai and making himself known to all of Israel, and Moshe Rabbeinu ascending to the mountain to meet Hashem to receive the Torah, we had that nullification of this, so that now the fullness of the light of Hashem could flow back and forth from the upper world to the lower world in the giving of the Torah, which has not ended. And that's why I'm talking about it being so powerful. Why? Because I talked about us being vessels, and this is the beauty of this month of Ziv, this month of radiance. And I think people miss this concept of how powerful it is to count the Omer, to set aside that time for it, and to, in a way, when we talk about this being a harvest and kind of being an agricultural festival in a sense, in culminating in the barley harvest of bringing the Omer to the Kohen, to the priest, who waves it before Hashem. I don't know if you do any gardening at your place.
Yes, we do something. Yeah.
But you always go out and you tend the garden. You water the garden. You have to weed the garden. You take care of it. You want to see things grow. You want to see things fruit. You want to see something happen. You certainly don't want to see things die. And this relates to us during this time spiritually as well. I liken it to us viewing ourselves as a garden during this time, and and we have these attributes that we call midot in Hebrew, um, and all of these attributes that Hashem has, like Chesed, loving kindness, and Rachamim, mercy, and all of these different attributes that we should be working on ourselves during this time should be things that we should be watering. We should be tagging those things, so to speak, spiritually, and making sure that we're watering the garden and watering those midot, those attributes, and pulling the weeds and getting rid of those bad attributes, and really making ourselves a pure vessel for the Torah to be given again at Shavuot every year to receive. Because I believe on that day, every year, if we take the time to prepare ourselves in this month of VR, in this month of radiance, that Hashem will come to us on Shavuot if we prepare ourselves as pure vessels and fill us with infinite light for the year.
That seems very promising. I like it. I always liked the idea of understanding, like doing with gardening. That's always been kind of a neat comparison with how we walk out, the halacha, and so many different features, so it's kind of cool.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. I would rather you continue because I was fixed to change the topic, and if you had something to say, I'd rather hear what you had to say.
No, I was just going to say there are so many concepts related to this. One of the things that I often talk about is I talk about this concept of the idea of freedom, and it's funny, there are two words for freedom. I always talk about the two words chofesh and cherut. The interesting thing is that the word cherut actually doesn't exist at all in the context of the Tanakh. It's actually kind of, I don't want to say it's a made-up word. The two words that we see for freedom in the Tanakh are chofesh, that I talk about, and actually dror. When we talk about Rav Dror, his name actually means liberty.
That's cool.
It's one of the words for freedom. But where we got this concept of cherut actually comes from the Hebrew word charut, which means to be engraved. And it comes from this idea of avot in the Mishnah Avot, which is fathers, Avot 6. They teach us not to read it as charut, engraved, but to read it as cherut. And what it is this concept of chofesh is a freedom that comes when Bnei Israel were freed from Paro, from Pharaoh in Mitzrayim, okay? And they were free to do as they pleased at that point, okay? And that kind of freedom is not always such a good thing. Actually, there's a verse in the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges. It's actually the last verse in the book of Judges. I think it's in Judges chapter 21, verse 25. And it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. That would be the kind of freedom that we were talking about when Bnei Israel left Egypt. It was this idea of they had freedom to do what they wanted to do. The interesting thing is that when they come and they camp at Har Sinai, what's interesting? If you go and you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't say they camped. It says he camped.
Oh, wow.
It's singular.
Singular. How about that?
And why is it singular? It's because during that preparation of those days leading up from the time that they began counting, those 49 days to the time of the giving of the Torah, they came together and became one.
Nice.
It's as if they came as one person to Hashem together. Why? Because it was taught that the reason that Hashem had to deliver them from Mitzrayim at that time was because they were in the 49th level of impurity. That there are 50 gates of impurity or 50 levels of impurity, and Bnei Yisrael was at the 49th level. That if he didn't deliver them from Mitzrayim at that time, they would have entered the 50th gate and there would have been no hope for them.
Wow.
And that the reason why we have is a very spiritual concept now, this 49, this idea of counting 7 sevens, that going from 49 gates of impurity to 49 gates of holiness,
nice.
culminating in the holiness and the sanctification. That's why it's so powerful coming from a parsha like Kiddushim, where Hashem is saying, I want you to be holy because I am holy. He goes through all of these things, telling them how they need to be holy when they enter into the land. He goes in and talks about the holiness of the Kohanim when they come into the land. And it's over and over and over and over, this idea of holiness, culminating in them coming after 49 days and receiving the Torah, going from 49 levels of impurity to 49 ascending again, once again, like we talked about, this idea of descending. They had descended into 49 levels of impurity, and now they're ascending through these 49 gates of sanctification or holiness to receive the Torah. This, again, is a concept that applies to us today as well.
You know what?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about all this stuff. It took me a while to kind of, like, I guess you could say, soften up to the idea of Kabbalah in the sense of things, because I was taught from such a early young Christian that sort of thing was like evil and all this other stuff. But there's actually stories in the Tanakh. I think the last time we were together, we may have even discussed it or touched base on it, where there were some really mystical things that actually happened in the Torah that was never explained, and it was never condemned. Like when Jacob, for example, whenever he knew how to produce certain colored sheep just by stripping poplar and placing them in front of them while they're doing their thing. And I'm like, that is some really, really deep stuff. And it doesn't say that God condemned him for any kind of thing like that. And so that's like on a heavier end, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, look, even if you look at the Merkavah, if you look at the chariot in the book of Ezekiel.
Oh, right on. Yeah.
This whole concept is very Kabbalistic. This idea of building the chariot, all through the Kabbalah, you'll read about this, and it's a very spiritual concept. It's even within the counting of the Omer that we do, there are Kabbalistic connections to it. In other words, many people who count the Omer on a daily basis will count the Omer and then count it in relation to, there are different Sephirot, there are different emanations that we see in the Eitz Chaim, Keter, Chochmah, Binah being the top three, crown, wisdom, and knowledge or understanding. And then we go down the list, all the way down to Malchut, which is at our level, which means kingdom. So, for instance, today is the 27th day of the counting of the Omer at sundown tonight, and after sundown we would do the counting. Just to give you an idea of the laws of the counting of the Omer, typically you would stand up. I'm not going to stand, but maybe we should do that. Maybe I'll do that real quick for your listeners.
Okay.
We'll count today's Omer so that they get an understanding of how. Because one of the things that it says in Leviticus, it talks about not just counting the day, but counting the weeks as well.
Okay.
So what we do is we say the blessing first. We say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu B'Mitzvotav V'Tzivanu Al Sfirat HaOmer, and then we go to the particular day, and today is the 12th of Iyar, and so we say Shivat Ve'esrim Yom LaOmer Shehem Shlosha Shavuot V'Shisha Yamim. That today is 27 days of the Omer, which are 3 weeks and 6 days. And from a Kabbalistic standpoint, we are in Netzach of Yesod. We're in Netzach means victory, and Yesod is foundation. So we're in this concept of the victory of foundation. And each day of the counting of the Omer, in the 7 sevens, because there are 7 lower Sephirot on the Eitz Chaim, on the Tree of Life, each one of them is related to one of these 7 weeks. So it's we have Netzach of Yesod, and then tomorrow will be Netzach of the next Sephirah, and then so forth until the next week, which will be the next Sephirah, and it'll go through all of those 7. We just don't have a time for me to go into the whole concept of it, but really, I wanted people to understand that I know a lot of people early on have been taught about Kabbalah is evil, and Kabbalah is mysticism, and it's magic, and it's incantations.
Well, we've got bad examples. I mean, because with Hollywood, when you think Kabbalah and Hollywood, you think Madonna,
right?
And these pop stars who really are not even Jewish, or maybe they want to be. They're just experimenting with all these different things, and Christianity paints everything as evil. So
part of the problem is that there was a group, and I don't want to specifically speak against any particular person or individual, but there was a group that started. There are a lot of people that will see their things, and I'm going to tell your listeners that if they see anything related to the Kabbalah Center, that it's not something that they should look into, it's not something they should attach themselves to, and it's not something that they should learn from, because it's not legitimate Kabbalah. It is the Kabbalah that you see the stars following, the whole Madonna thing, the whole red stream thing, the whole where they will teach you, you don't need to know the Aramaic. You just scan the lines, scan the Aramaic. Don't worry if you can read it or understand it. Just look at it and read the English, and you'll be healed. Or you'll receive this wisdom, and that's shtuyot. It's nonsense. Anything that you need to learn with a legitimate teacher. And for somebody to say that you can understand the Kabbalah without understanding Aramaic, or without at least having a teacher who understands Aramaic, who you can sit down with and learn with, you're not really learning real Kabbalah. Right. And as I said, the Kabbalah is just the opposite. What it is that's the only way I can explain it is to say that what it does is it reveals the intention of the Torah. And I think maybe what we should do is maybe do a show on that one day.
Yeah, I don't mind. That'd be fun.
Specifically like Kabbalah 101.
Yeah, I think that would be great, because that's the number one thing that needs to be cleared up, is that there is more than one Kabbalah in the sense of the way the world knows it. So I think that would be... And I think it's important. One of the things that I'm going to tell is... I will tell people that are really interested in this, because I know you probably get asked about it. I know I get asked about it all the time. And I see this discussion come up all the time on Facebook, when I try to not spend as much time on there as I used to, but I see people, and there is a book that I do recommend. I actually know one of the people who translated it. She translated it with her husband of blessed memory. Her name is Yedida Cohen. She's a friend of ours from Tzfat, and she, with her husband, translated the work of Rav Ashlag, who was considered one of the great modern day Kabbalists. He was called the Sulam, which means the ladder. Just a great rabbi with incredible wisdom. And the book is in English, and it's called In the Shadow of the Ladder. And what it is it's an introduction to Kabbalah. And I suggest that anybody that really is interested in that study, before they go and they start trying to study the Zohar, or they start trying to study the Kabbalah on their own, they should try to get a copy of that book called In the Shadow of the Ladder. It's translated by Yedida and Mark Cohen.
and it will open up to you an understanding of what the Zohar is about and what Kabbalah is about.
Nice, nice. Okay, so before we get out of here completely, I guess, so we only had 2 chapters this week, is that correct? Because next week is it talking about the feasts on 23, right? Or is that included this week?
So no, that's in Emor as well.
Okay, okay.
The feasts in chapter 23.
So real quick question, what do we need to take out of 21 and 22 that would pertain to us today?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. A lot of what we see in 21 and 22, we don't take out anything because we don't have Beit HaMikdash,
right?
And because we don't have a temple. So, for instance, even the concept of the counting of the Omer is really just a spiritual thing at this point. Why? It's in a sense a rabbinic enactment at this point, because we don't have Beit HaMikdash, meaning that we can't literally bring the Omer. We can't bring that barley harvest because it had to be brought to the Kohanim at the Beit HaMikdash, at the temple. So a lot of what we see today we can't do. It's important to recognize that when we look at Leviticus 23 and we see the appointed times of Hashem, that in essence, a lot of what we do today is zecher, is remembrances. In other words, people talk about keeping Pesach. We don't keep Pesach. What Passover is to us today is a remembrance. Why? We don't have the ability to bring the Passover offering. Pesach is that one day, or Pesach is that one offering that was brought. And then it's called Chag HaMatzot after that, the Feast of Unleavened Bread for the rest of the time. So in essence, what we're doing is, that was a one-time deal, the Passover. It was that idea of bringing deliverance, to the people from Mitzrayim at that time. And now a lot of what we're told to do is do these things as a remembrance. So we do them. We have to understand in the Tanakh today that there's a lot that we cannot do. When people say to me that are non-believers, when I say non-believers, I'm not talking about typical non-believers that are used, that Christians call non-believers. I'm talking about somebody who doesn't believe in keeping the Torah or keeping the Tanakh. That somebody will look at me and go, "Oh, you keep all the 613 mitzvot?" And I go, "No, I don't keep 613 mitzvot." Why? Because first of all, there's not a temple. I'm not required to keep the mitzvot related to women.
Right.
I'm not required to keep the mitzvot related to the Kohanim or the Levi'im. There are certain things that many Jews can't do because they don't live in the land of Israel. But that doesn't mean that because I can't do those things, that I'm not supposed to do the things that I can do. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we get into it. Quite frankly, at this point, I would say that, of the 613 mitzvot, most of us are probably only able to keep maybe in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 of the mitzvot when we think about it, because so many of them are related to the temple, and many of them are not related to us, and again, only related to people being in the land of Israel and so forth. So
okay, so the appointed feast, I guess we'll close out. I know most of our Parsha are about 3 chapters average, so
and we never get into discussing we're lucky if we get through 1 or 2 verses.
I know, that's why I'm kind of jumping all over the place too. I'll tell you something. This is interesting for me. During the feast, as it goes on, when it starts going on from Pesach and it goes into discussing Yom Kippur, I think for me that was the most confusing part when I first started questioning the New Testament. That confused me the most because I was seeing the reading of them in Leviticus 23, and they were like back to back in the reading. And so in my mind, I was thinking, I almost couldn't tell that it was talking about 2 different holy days. So unless you do study the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures as it's properly known, you're going to probably conflate the 2 together and probably still be deceived about how you might think that Passover was for us, this is a sacrifice for sin. I even had a very, well, I thought was a very well studied older woman who was Christian at one time for many years and moved to Messianic Christian, and she said, she goes, well, this is very simple. The very simple explanation to why Yom Kippur versus Passover is, she said, Passover or Yom Kippur was for a national sacrifice, and it said Passover or Pesach was for personal sacrifice. And at the time, I didn't know enough to say anything. I was like, oh, okay, well, I never heard of that before. That's definitely a new one, And then, of course, that falls by the wayside as well. But it's interesting how many creative ideas people come up with to try to still make it fit.
So one might be able to argue that point, but the issue becomes that when you're talking about the sacrifice that was made on Passover, and you're talking about blood that was placed upon the doorposts of the houses, and that we talk about the malach, the angel of death, so to speak, that passes over and passes over the houses and does not destroy the firstborn of the nation of Israel. I always ask a simple question: who did that blood cover? And in context, the truth is that blood did not cover everybody in the house.
It was just the
that blood simply covered the firstborn in the house. So how was it a sacrifice for sin? It wasn't in context. And when you talk about Yom Kippur, and you're talking about the two sacrifices, one that says Le Hashem, for Hashem, and the other one saying La Azazel, for Azazel, and the priest at that time places his hands upon that sacrifice, and he places the sins of Israel upon that sacrifice. It's the sacrifice that goes out alive.
Right.
It has the sins on it.
Yeah,
it's not the one
that died or
that's
was
killed.
Offered. Right. That is so true. That is so true. That was one of the first things that kind of threw me for a loop too. I was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? So, and then you get into the whole idea of trying to fit Barabbas, in the New Testament as the scapegoat. But then again, it's like you've got the whole scapegoat issue altogether. So it's pretty bizarre. But
well, it's very interesting. Yeah. It's very easy to take a book that you already have and write another book to fit what you already have and make things kind of fit. But at the end of the day, it's not about us trying to convince anybody of anything. At the end of the day, it always comes down to somebody being on their own path, having their own journey, but willing to be open to the idea of learning. And not just being teachers. Part of the problem that I see with most people in Christianity, in the Messianic movement, in the Hebrew roots movement, is there's no opening for them to be taught. They all want to be teachers.
You know what's funny? What you're saying now makes so much sense because me and my daughter, my 13-year-old daughter, had a conversation last week. It was funny. She was right in the middle of homeschool. She says, "Daddy," she goes, "why is it that the months, September, October, November, December, all end in ER, and then January, February, and they're like paired up with two?" And I said, it's very simple. I said, because September, October, November, December, it's like Burr is the last. It's like Burr, it's cold, so it's like the colder seasons. And then in January and February, it's like, well, by January and February, you become weary because it's so dang cold all the time. And all of a sudden, March shows up, and she goes, "Really?" She goes, "That makes so much sense." And I was like, okay, no. That's not true. I was only saying that. But see, the point being, I mean, whenever Christians are told these fables or these stories, they don't proof to find them out if they're true or not. They just think, well, if it sounds good, then that must be the gospel truth.
But I love those Mishle comes from the idea of mashal.
Explain.
These proverbs. Mishle means proverbs, and mashal is like a proverb. So I love those that you put up. You don't realize that you're putting up a mashal, but that's what you're doing.
Oh, cool.
When you put up those little things on Facebook, like you just did. Okay. Explaining to your daughter that, and then when you say that, well, this is how typically, you see Christians acting.
Right.
I don't think you understand how powerful it is, the kind of things that you post.
Sounds like I need to put that on Facebook.
Yeah, I was going to say, how come I didn't read that on Facebook? That one.
That's funny. I'll have to put that up after we're done. So, wow. Well, Ira, man, I'll tell you what, we got to plan something with you. Maybe like you said, Kabbalah 101. Just let me know your schedule. I know right now you're landing the plane psychologically and trying to calm down. So once your jet lag wears off, and even if it's as early as next week, just let me know and we'll put up a show, Kabbalah 101. I think that'd be fantastic.
Maybe in the next couple of weeks we'll plan that.
Hey, we'll keep in touch for sure. I know there's going to be a lot of interesting people who would be interested in it as well. So.
All right, cool.
Well, it has been fun. Ira, until next time, thank you so much for your time. Always love you, man. Take care. Shalom, everybody.
Shalom from Yerushalayim.
Shalom, shalom. Take care, everybody.